Perhaps the most insidious bit of misinformation regarding the Crusades is the idea that they involved forcibly converting Muslims or other non Christians to Christianity at sword point. This idea has become so widespread that it is just taken as a given by many contemporary critics of the Crusades. A cursory look at some popular literature bears this out. Emma Johnson, for example, claims forced conversion has been a recurring feature of religious expansion throughout history. It involves the use of coercion, violence, or other forms of pressure to compel individuals or groups to adopt a particular religious belief. During the Crusades, forced conversions of Muslims and Jews occurred in conquered territories. Similarly, David Kling asserts that the 11th to 15th centuries witnessed the persecution of Jews and heretics, crusades against Muslims, and the increasing acceptance of forced conversions. David Lantigua argues along the same lines, saying, "Nothing in the Middle Ages shaped Christian infidel relations more than the Papal Crusades and Holy War. Holy War's growing popularity vitiated Christian infidel relations by corrupting the peaceful ethic of evangelization taught by Jesus, the apostles, and the early church. The violent excesses of the First Crusade were a major turning point. Marauding bands of armed pilgrims who decimated certain Jewish and Muslim communities from Germany to Egypt represented egregious examples of forced baptism under a policy of conversion or death." And Kaner and Kaner add, "Certainly the papal forces sometimes sought to convert the heathen, but their methods were flawed. They sought to force conversion by the sword in a type of Christian jihad. As logic dictates that forced conversion is no conversion at all, one is perplexed by the tragically misguided and brutally vicious Crusaders." As popular as the idea of Europeans forcing Muslims to convert to Christianity may be, there is one major problem with this narrative. It never happened. Or, at least, any incidents where it did were overwhelmingly isolated, irregular, and discouraged by canon law. It was most assuredly not the purpose of any of the Crusades in the Holy Land to convert the Muslims to Christianity. As Jonathan Riley Smith points out, forcible conversions were, of course, directly contrary to the injunctions of canon law, about which educated churchmen were in no doubt. For centuries, the principle had been repeatedly enunciated that infidels, and particularly Jews, should never be forced to the faith, but could only be persuaded by reason. The Crusades, at least initially, had nothing to do with converting people to Christianity. Muslims were overwhelmingly viewed as enemies, not potential converts. There were many reasons why Pope Urban II launched the First Crusade in 1095. He wanted to answer Byzantium's call for help. He wanted to roll back the threat of Islamic expansion into Europe. He wanted to protect Christian pilgrims in the Holy Land. He wanted to liberate Christians suffering under the iron fist of their Muslim overlords. He wanted to recapture the places where Jesus had lived for Christianity, and he wanted to exert his authority over the knights of Catholic Europe. There is abundant evidence to support that all of these were major catalysts for launching the First Crusade. There is no evidence whatsoever to suggest that evangelism was ever part of the vision. As Steve Weidenkopf puts it, despite the belief of modern-day critics, the Crusades were not wars of conversion comparable to those that had helped Islam spread by the sword. Indeed, engaging in warfare simply for the conversion of others was never a criterion for just war, nor does the historical record indicate that this is what motivated the Crusaders. Now, more careful critics of the Crusades are well aware that the Crusades in the Holy Land never involved evangelistic aims. However, they will be swift to point out that the practically unknown Northern Crusades in northeastern Europe did indeed come to include an evangelistic component. Converting the pagans was one of the principal goals of these military campaigns. The Muslim apologist Javad Hashmi makes precisely this point, saying,
outside of Europe, Christendom kept expanding, and they used their interpretation of the Bible. That was their interpretation of the New Testament, the belief of the emperor as God's rod on earth, and their Old Testament interpretation and their own conception of Christendom as the new Israel. And so they had a doctrine of the equivalent of perpetual warfare that we'll look at. And so they waged hundreds of years of warfare of the Northern Crusades. So he's going to argue that the Crusades were just defensive. These are the Northern Crusades waged for hundreds of years against the pagans to forcibly convert them.
And while critics like Hashmi are correct that there was an evangelistic component included within the Northern Crusades, it is really misleading for them to simply state this without explaining what this actually looked like in practice. Because of the aforementioned myth regarding the Crusaders converting Muslims to Christianity at sword point, unqualified statements like Hashmi's give popular audiences the impression that the Northern Crusades involved giving Baltic pagans the choice to convert or die, but nothing could be further from the truth. The evangelistic efforts of the Northern Crusades were explicitly not to be carried out by military campaigns. Rather, the military campaigns were seen as making evangelism possible, and thereby contributing to evangelism only indirectly. The actual act of evangelism was to be carried out by Christian missionaries, not Crusader knights. As William Urban, perhaps the foremost historian of the Northern Crusades in the English-speaking world, puts it, according to canon law, a holy war was a last resort, and even then, it was but an indirect means of Christianization. The Crusaders were to avoid the physical destruction of the pagans because their immortal souls would surely be lost, and the destruction of their property and rights was to be avoided lest that hinder the missionaries in overcoming their hatred and distrust. The object of a crusade was not to compel the unbelievers to crowd into a baptismal font at the point of a sword. Only uneducated fanatics would do that, but to make it possible for missionaries to persuade by example and the word of God. The Crusaders were permitted only to prevent anyone from hindering the priests from preaching to unbelievers. And elsewhere he writes, the role of the Christian knight was not to spread the gospel, but to protect those who had the calling and training to do so. We will explore this matter in greater detail later on in this series, but for now, I hope it is clear that the Crusades in the Holy Land had nothing to do with forcibly converting people to Christianity, and even the later Crusades, which did include evangelistic efforts, were far more nuanced than simply telling pagans to convert or die.